previous to that. Nope. Okay. All right. Today we are going to continue our discussion of multivariate state space models. These will look somewhat familiar to, actually, they should look a lot familiar to you after last week and earlier this week stuff. You will continue to see this form throughout the rest of the quarter with respect to many models. But please, again, if at any point we need just to stop for a moment and chat about things, absolutely, we will do that. Okay, so what are we going to talk about today? We're going to start this conversation by just sort of motivating this kind of notion of deterministic versus stochastic components of models. Eli talked a little bit about this last time when we were thinking about covariates in Marsh models. Then we're going to talk about regression with autocorrelated errors. We touched on that a little bit briefly already. Then we'll talk about regression with temporal random effects. If that doesn't mean anything to you, as I just said those words, that's fine. It will by the end of class. And then we'll get into this notion of dynamic factor analysis, and we'll talk about different aspects of this when thinking about covariance matrices. There's a few little tricks we have to use when we fit these models to make them identifiable. We'll talk about that, and then ways that we can interpret the results. Okay, meeting is being recorded. Okie dokie. If you want to follow along, the code is downloadable there. Okay, so let's think about an incredibly simple statistical model. So here we have a collection, and these aren't even time series, right? We're just going to index this with something I. It could be time, but it could just be membership in a group. And this model is super simple. We just have a mean plus or minus some error, and that error is a white noise term. It's just that mean zero and some variance. If you think about that right-hand side of the equation, really there's two aspects to this. You could think about this mean as being deterministic. That is going to be fixed for all observations, right? And the stochastic aspect is going to move around depending on which observation we're thinking of. So the idea, we have some overall mean, so everything starts somewhere, and then you just subtract a little bit one way or the other, and you've got that. Sometimes in the literature, you will see these referred to fixed and random. That's not always the same notion, but in general, this is one way to think about this, where this random effect is something that's typically drawn from a distribution. Fixed effects are typically assumed to be unknown, but they exist as an object itself, not drawn from some larger distribution. So if we take this simple model, right here, this is that same one we had, right, where we just said it was a mean plus some error. We can rewrite this model this way. So now, instead of talking about some expectation mu plus or minus some error, where the errors are white noise, we're just going to talk about a distributional form for the data themselves. So all we did was basically take this mean and pull it inside this distribution. So now this just says any observation we have from that data set is going to be distributed normally with some mu and some variance around that. And in most of ecology and natural resources, this is a very common way of writing models. If you go to a stats department or look in a lot of stats book, this is the way most of them write models. Okay? Absolutely equivalent. There's no difference between those models whatsoever. Okay, we can expand that deterministic bit now, right? So here I've replaced that kind of overall mean with an alpha, an intercept plus some slope, beta times that thing. And here I'm calling it mean. You could also think of this as expectation. Remember that we talked about that first day of class? So what we expect is that for some value I, we might explain that by some predictor variable here, x, a slope, and an intercept. And equivalently, we could rewrite that model this way. So here's our expectation. The mean here you could think of is going to be given by alpha plus beta x. And then there's going to be some variation around that. Okay, So here now, let's start. So that was just kind of any model for any set of data. Now let's start talking about time series specifically. So we're going to think about using this T subscript. So this is that same model we started with, but now we're thinking about observations collected in order over time. So we've got some mean plus some white noise. And we could do something bigger where now we're going to replace that just overall mean with some function of a predictor variable. Here it's x of t. So we've got some time series that we think is a function of another. That's basically all this says. You could rewrite it this way as well. Was there a question over there? Okay. Okay, so here is an example of that model, right? So here I've said y of t is going to be some intercept plus a slope times a predictor with some noise. Here's an example of that. So here I've got x of t, and here I've got y of t, which is equal to 1 plus 5 times this plus a little bit of error. Okay. And if you squint at this, you could probably see that those two look to be positively covarying. That's what 5 times x is giving us. Now what I want to do is actually focus in on this residual term here for a second. So we have a model. Something is a function of something else plus some kind of stochastic remainder. And if you plot that E sub t, this is what it looks like. And remember that in most of those models, well, in this model and specifically, I said that this should have some mean and variance, and the expectation here should be 0. But if we plot that out, we get something like this, and to me, this does not look like white noise. It looks to be fairly autocorrelated, actually. So like some sort of autoregressive AR model would probably suffice. And in fact, if we pass these residuals to our friend, the autocorrelation function, look at this. We see really, there's significantly and fairly strong autocorrelation at a lag of 1. There's also some funny correlation out here at a lag of 13. Can anyone figure out why this might be? Sorry, I had 2 answers at once. I'll go with Ben. I think you were first.
It is some sort of annual cycle.
Maybe but 13. So maybe, Brian, what was your guess?
Seasonal.
Could be. Somebody else?
Oh, no, sorry.
Okay. All right, Tina got it. This is, yeah, totally random here. There's no structure in this data that would suggest it. So I just got lucky or unlucky when I did this, as a matter of fact. So this is just an example of have to kind of be aware of some of that. It's good to think about, right? We had a couple of good guesses here. Maybe it was some annual cycle, maybe it was something about a season. But in this case, there's really nothing in that structure that would suggest that. So anyway, we can see that these errors are correlated from time step to time step. So clearly, assuming a mean of 0 is probably not a good idea, right? Because that's our expectation. So that would say, if we back up here, if we assume that it was an expectation of 0, it doesn't matter where you are in this time series, your guess would be here. 0. And instead, what this information is telling us is that probably a better guess for this value is not 0, but this value. Or for this one, it would actually be here. Over here, it would be there, right? To say something about it's the last value is probably going to give you a better guess. Okay. So what we can do then is expand that stochastic part of our model to include some autocorrelated errors. So that's really what we've done here, right? We just said, all right, let's take this error term E and let's just make this an AR1 process. So the errors today are some fraction, typically if this is less than 1 in absolute value, of the errors yesterday plus some white noise. And well, this is just white noise. Sorry, that's what that term over there says. Okay, if you think about this and squint real hard, this is just a very straightforward state space model, a univariate state space model. And we'll show you if that's not making immediate sense. Let's walk through that. Okay, here's that equation we started with. we said y sub t is alpha plus beta times x sub t plus some errors. So here all I'm going to do is let's rearrange this equation. So just put the error in front. No reason why. And then what if we call that error term x sub t? We'll call this alpha a, and we'll call this big D times d sub t. And if you do some appropriate substitutions, some of these other things will go away. This should look familiar to some folks, maybe all of you, hopefully. You think about the stuff that Eli was talking about last week and Tuesday. This is basically the observation component of our state space model. Okay, so then let's think about, here's our state equation. So here's what I said our error terms were going to be. We want this autocorrelated error, plus or minus some weight noise. So let's just do a substitution. We already said before that E sub t was X. We're going to call phi B, and we'll call WT WT. This should look a lot like the process or the state component of a state space model. So here's that model we started with. Here's our linear regression. Here's our autocorrelated errors. By just doing some substitution, just calling things differently, we've arrived at this. And Eli talked quite a bit about this model already. All right. So it's a little bit different thinking because in the past we were thinking about this as being some sort of like true state of nature. This might have been like the true population size or the true length of reproductive age females or something like this. And based on the data, these observations, why we were going to try to uncover the hidden state. And in this formulation, this is just an observation model. And now we have autocorrelated errors. So we've just rewritten things. And you are going to see time and time again in this class, we're going to do things like this, where if we have a general framework here, a general state space thing, by taking some of these things away or adding them back in, we can make lots of different forms of models. On Tuesday of next week, we'll be back at this again, looking at state space models, but from a very different perspective. These states won't be kind of states of nature as we've been thinking about. These are actually going to be regression parameters in a model. And that will force you to kind of readjust your thinking as to how we've been dealing with these state space models. But the idea is, if we go over to a whiteboard and we sit down and we come up with a model that we can largely cast into this framework, we're done. Because we have lots of ways to solve this set of equations. Yeah. Why is there no like z times x that we have here? Oh, yes. Here, back, you're saying this one here? I've just rewritten that where this thing we're going to call x, right? Because in this one, look at these substitutions. So I said BT goes away, so just take that out. And then the rest of these, beta is D, X is D. Yep. Yeah, so this is just a way. Normally we thought of these as the errors, but by just rewriting this, we're going to treat this thing as the error. Okay. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so you've seen a little bit now of the Mars package. So to make, this is the model you want. This is our linear regression model. This is this full form for a Mars model. So basically you'd have wire your data. A is going to be an intercept. D is the slope. This D sub T is your covariate. We don't want any multiplier on X here, so that becomes a 1. And R goes to 0 because we want this thing to be 0 for all T. So this is the way you would code that for your model list in Mars. Similarly, this is that full state equation in Mars, and we want this. So in order to go from this to this, what do we have to do? Well, B, we want that to be just B, so we can call it anything we want. We want a variance term for this. I'm just calling that Q. U, let's see, that doesn't occur anywhere in this equation, so we better set U to 0. How about big C? That's nowhere in this equation, so we set that to 0. And little c, same thing, it's not here anywhere, so we just set that to 0 for all t. So once again, you can start to think about taking equations that look like this in a full form and starting to rearrange some things, and you can basically get Mars to fit many, many different kinds of models by just either setting things to 0 or 1 or doing some appropriate substitution. Okay, any questions about that before we start digging in a little deeper? Okay, let's start thinking about some more random effects here. So let's go back to that very simple model we started with, right? We had this mu plus some error term, and we talked about the mu as being fixed and the errors as being random. You could expand the random portion here. So we started with an E sub t, and previously we said that had mean 0 and some variance. Now let's add in another one, and this one is going to be autocorrelated. So we've got two sources of random variation here. One, every time step we just grab into our bag of marbles and pull something up from this normal distribution. The other one, we start where we were the previous time step and then add a little bit of wiggle to that. Okay, so these errors would be independent from one time step to another. There's no dependence here. These entirely dependent on one another from time step to time step. So one of these is going to be this kind of funny white noise series, and one of them is going to have some sort of random walk component to it. Okay, this model is simply a random walk observed with error. So you've seen, don't worry about this second bit right now, random walk model. I'm guessing everyone in here could write out a random walk model right now. I will just do that very quickly over here. So folks, as a reminder. This thing is distributed normally with some mean, 0, and some variance. And what do I mean when I said that thing is just a random walk observed with error? Well, we're going to start with that. That's going to be kind of our true state of nature. But now we have some additional complexity on top of that. And I apologize. When you are standing right next to that board, it's quite bold. But for like Anna and Nicole, you might not be able to read that at all. Okay, so to see that, let's again decompose this model again. So here is basically, I started with this model, right? I said it was a mean plus some autocorrelated error plus some white noise sequence. So let's just write that out. So here, there's our white noise, and there's our autoregressive error component. And again, let's just do some simple substitutions. Y is the same. We're going to call mu A. We're going to call f of t x sub t. We'll call E sub t v sub t. This looks like your observation equation that we've been working with. And now we're going to call f of t x f x w w. So here now is our random walk observed with error. So we've just taken, this is our random walk, and we've just added essentially some additional noise to it. If it had an expectation of 0, that thing could go away. That would even be more simple. Right, so that says you've got some random walk, but we don't get to see that. What we've got is some observations of that random walk that are imperfect. There's some sampling error. So again, if you had come in and said, Mark, I want a model that has some fixed mean, and I want two different sources of error, one to be white noise and one to be autocorrelated. And I told you, oh, that's just a random walk with an observation error. Most people don't see this at all. And don't feel bad if you don't. That's why we're talking about it today. So they are entirely equivalent. And you can see that just written out this way. So this is the way we would write this model in Mars. This is the way you might see it written in a paper you pick up later this afternoon. Okay, same thing here, right? We made this random component a little more detailed. We had two different components to it. We can do the same thing with that fixed component. We don't have to just settle for a mean. We can say, well, give me an intercept plus the effect of some other exogenous variable, temperature, for instance. And if we fit this model, you could rewrite this again. Here's where we started. And you could rewrite that in this Mars state space framework. So here now, we've just added in this effect of that covariate. So again, you've seen this equation and you've seen this equation, and together they form a state space model. Okay. Any questions about that? So some of this is motivated just to help you see that you can make things, you can start with something very simple and then start building that detail into it. And I've had a few chats with students in class about your projects, and we've talked, let's start really simple, and then we can build more detail into it, right? Hang a skeleton out first, and then we'll start putting, you know, some skin and bones and organs in it, that sort of thing. Okay, here is a situation now where we're going to move away from a univariate response and start thinking about multiple time series. So here's a model where we've got two or more. We can just make it two to start with. So what I've done here now is I've added this additional index I, and all that says is which time series we're talking about. 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And then everything else is the same. We've got these T's. Okay. Here's our random walk observed with error. Here's our random walk. And these are the data, and the data say it's this random walk plus some error. And this, remember, is just a bias term. It just determines whether we're shifting this thing up or down relative to the truth. So if this had an expectation of 0, that term would essentially go away. It'd just be 0. Here now, I've written this out a little more explicitly. So in this case, I've dropped that I subscript, and I've just made, we're writing out the equation for observation 1, observation 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever n is, 10, 100, it could be anything. And same with the states, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. If we now collect all of that stuff together in a matrix or a vector, we can just write this super compactly. Right, so here's a vector of our observations at time t. There's a vector of the states at time t. Vector of errors, because we're dealing with multivariates, these need to be multivariate normals now. Covariance matrix R, covariance matrix Q. By the end of this class, if I end up on your committee and I ask you to draw out a really simple state space model, I hope that all of you can do this, because man, you're going to see this a lot moving from here on out. Okay, let's imagine now we've got lots of time series. We were just talking about 2, 3, 4, something like that. Here's 25, I believe it is. And I simulated all of these. If you stare at these for a little while, I suspect that you might be able to pick out some common patterns here. Right? I mean, for instance, here's some that generally seem to be going down. Here's something that generally seems to be going down. Here's something I was thinking went up. This almost looks like a mirror image of it. So it's not at all uncommon, especially in ecology and environmental science, that we might go out and collect a lot of information time series in this case of different things, and I haven't put a y-axis on here. It could be anything, counts of individuals, sizes, fecundity, densities, you name it. If these were all collected, maybe in a similar range or for a similar species, we might actually think, huh, I saw some of you nodding when I said, can you see some common patterns in here? It's entirely possible that we could pick out just a few common patterns from all of these and use that as sort of a model from which to work. And that's basically the motivation for where we're going through now. So when dealing with environmental data that are driven by some other forcing, it's super common that you will see some covariance among them. Oftentimes it's positive, things are kind of generally going up or down together, but sometimes they're out of phase, they're going in different directions. So I already asked this, and I think everyone can convince themselves that, yeah, some of these are generally going up, some are generally going down, some have some sort of peak or valley in them. And it turns out that indeed there are. All 25 of these came from these 3 core time series. So every one of these is here is just some linear combination of these 3 plus a little bit of error. And I know that because I simulated them. So the idea is what we'd like to do sometimes, right, is given a huge collection of time series like this, whoops, sorry, can we pull out what these common patterns are? Because this is often what we're most interested in, giving a large sample of the environment. Okay, so let's return to this notion of this state space model. And I don't remember, I was gone a week ago. Eli, did you talk about like doing population structure, like the harbor seal example?
Yep.
So you guys
remember? Sure, for them to see it again.
Okay,
yeah.
So do you remember this, where the idea was, I think it was from Eric's paper, where they're looking at harbor seal kind of meta population ideas, and you could just make some assumptions about that based on how you made Z. Okay. So that's pretty straightforward, right? We could do that. So here was a situation where we had counts at 5 different locations. And one of our possible models was, okay, count 1 comes from Strait of Juan de Fuca, counts 2 and 3 are in North Puget Sound, and counts 4 and 5 are from South Puget Sound. Okay, this was the model you looked at. There may be some adjustments relative to those, and then here's our state model. So this is just this model written out more explicitly. So we have 5 observations and 3 different states. Okay, and basically we can fit this, and then remember, we can mess around with this. We can make this a column of ones. We can make it an identity matrix and test different assumptions about how we think that kind of meta population structure works. Okay, what if now these counts were from haul out areas, and the sea lions hauling out at those areas were foraging in different locations? And they were actually generally separated, but they came together on occasion and got counted. So rather than being just solely from the Strait of Juan de Fuca, what if some come from the Strait of Juan de Fuca and some come from North Puget Sound? Those areas are fairly close together. It'd be trivial for a pinniped to swim that far in a day. Okay. So maybe what we have is something that looks like this. Okay, so the counts we made up in the northern part of the sound, 80% of those animals came from the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and 20% of them came from North Puget Sound. Why 2? 20% came from the Strait of Juan de Fuca and swam over. Most are from the North Sound, right? Do you get it? So here's 90% and 10, 30 and 70, 10 and 9. Yeah, did you have?
Is it possible to estimate that Z matrix? I can see how it is just a distribution. This, but like
yeah, right. So what he's saying is that every row of this matrix, the way I've written it, has to sum to 1. So this would be a perfectly adequate time series model. It seems completely reasonable to me. The crux of this is, though, who's going to tell us that this is 80% and that's 20%? I don't think, maybe some of these animals are tagged or branded, but none of them are running around with a little ID on their collar that says it lost calling. So we don't know what that is, right? We typically don't know that this is 80-20 or it's 20-70 and 10%. So what one option would be, holy moly, try every single combination of percentages, right? Just keep shuffling around things within these rows so they always add to 1, but do that. I'm here to tell you, you'll never finish your dissertation if you start that exercise. Okay. So what if we could agree with that? Yeah, they're probably not all from the same location. There's some mixture. There's animals doing their things and they all get together on occasion, but we don't know what this is. Z is unknown to us, right? How many columns should we put in here for different states of nature? The rows are going to be fixed because those will always equal the rows in Y. And what are those things in there? Are they 0? Are they 1? Are they 0.5 and 0.5? That sort of thing. So that's where dynamic factor analysis comes in. And really what this is a dimension reduction technique. We'll compare this to something like PCA in a minute, where the idea is that we have some number of observed time series, I'm just calling it N, and we want to model those as a function of some number of hidden states, M. And the idea here is that we want M to be much, much smaller than N. So right in that example I started with, this was 25, and this was 3. Okay, so the idea here is we're generally looking for common patterns in the data over time. Yeah, at that point, so good question. So Tina's saying, what if Z equal them? This thing would be an identity matrix. And that would say for every observation, we have a unique state. At that point, there's no, everything is unique. We don't need any common patterns because we're just going to say, you're all special. Here's your sort of driving force. So the question is, yeah, how can we figure out what this is? How many columns do we need in Z, which is how many states we're going to have, the dimension of X. Okay, so let's take a look at that. Here's dynamic factor analysis. You've now seen this model several times today alone. So the data are Y. This is going to be N by 1. So N rows and 1 column. Z is going to be N rows and have M columns. And here we always want to basically limit ourselves to a case where N is greater than M. So we don't want these two to be equal. This could be 25 and this could be 24. But typically, if this is 25, we'd like this to be something small, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5. And then our states here are going to be M by 1. So Y is a long vector. Hopefully, X is a relatively short vector. Okay. Many of you will have seen some version of a dimension reduction in something like PCA or DCA or NMDS. The idea with all of these is to take some high dimensional space. I was talking with a couple of students about this yesterday. This is just, you have to get really kind of meta here. It's super easy for us as humans to imagine things in 3 dimensions and 3 space, but 4, 5, just, I cannot make my brain work that way, okay? But imagine that we had something in 3 space, this room, and we wanted to know where everybody was sitting in this room. For the most part, I don't need to know anything about how tall this room is. I just need to know the X and the Y of the floor plan, and I can put all of you on a map. So we could reduce a 3-dimensional volume down to a 2-dimensional area, and I would still capture the locations of all of you. Now, if you were birds, and there were some trees in here and you were all sitting at different heights, that would be more difficult, but maybe we don't care about the heights. We just want to know where you are on the landscape and the fact that some of you are at the top of the trees and some are at the bottom, big deal. Okay, so here I'll just go through principal components analysis very, very briefly as sort of a motivator for this. So in principal components analysis, typically what you have are some number of axes that are always orthogonal. That means they form 90-degree angles to one another. And then you have some loadings on those axes, which when projected from some large dimensional space down into some small dimensional space allows you to basically see what's going on. And typically, we think of these principal components as we'd like to find two of them, because with humans, it's super easy to do a biplot, where this is principal component 1, and this is principal component 2, and we can see where our different things lie in that space. The weird thing about principal components, though, in these multidimensional spaces is they start to lose their inherent meaning. So let's say we had temperature, that's in Celsius. We had rainfall in millimeters. We had currents in some sort of flux, like 1,000 meters of 100,000 cubic meters of seawater per kilometer of coastline per day. So all these things with different funny things. Once we do this dimension reduction, these axes have labels that don't go from like -10 to 10 degrees Celsius. They'll go from like hot and dry to cold and wet. Turbulent and something to laminar and something else. And that's because, again, we had to take this very bizarre geometrical shape and smash it down into some very few dimensions. Okay, so this is basically the way you would calculate the principal components. You would take your data, and this is a large matrix, so there's no T here. So you maybe have each one of these as a record, time is running this way, you've got this very large matrix. Ask what the covariance of each one of those is, and then ask for the eigenvectors of that covariance matrix, and that will give you those principal components. And I'm going to show you an example of this so it makes more sense and not so abstract. Okay, here is a case where I have two variables, x and y, and they quite highly covary positively. And in fact, if you look at, you normalize the covariance by the standard deviation, the correlation here is 0.7. And remember that is to range from -1 to 1. So they're pretty strongly correlated. The idea here, though, is I need two axes, x and y, to describe these data. We could apply a principal components analysis and reduce those two dimensions down to 1. So if we do that, I can fit, there's two principal components here, 1 and 2. And if I then replot the data so that here's principal component 1 and here's principal component 2, you can see basically what's happened is I've taken this and that basis is essentially rotated around this axis right here. Okay, that's all that's happened. They've been replotted. And now, if you look at the correlation between PC1 and PC2, it's functionally 0. So now we've taken this XY data set and just reduced it down to PC1 times some loadings because we have to tell it how far away from that axis we are. So that's essentially all we're going to be doing in DFA. And if you wanted to see sort of the relationship between these, here's our observation model for a dynamic factor analysis. Here's how you would basically figure out a PCA. Here's that covariance, here's your loadings, and then here's some leftover bit, right? Because as you saw in the previous example, all the points do not lie perfectly on those principal components. We need to have some random variation away from it. In PCA, the form of this covariance matrix must be diagonal, meaning there's only values on the diagonal of a square matrix. There's nothing in the off diagonals to indicate that there's covariance, that two things go up and down together, or they go like that together, right? Or out of phase with one. In DFA, we can relax that. And this is mostly just a gee whiz thing, but I will show you later, and as part of the lab, You will explore different structures for things like R. So here's a situation where we have 4 time series and 4 different forms of R. So here, this one is diagonal and equal, right? Has the same variance term on it, so they're equal. This one is diagonal and unequal. I have 4 different variance terms, but no covariance. I might also impose a little more rich structure here. Here's one we call equal variance covariance. So it has equal variance and there's equal covariance. It doesn't matter where you are in this off diagonal, it's the same covariance. Here is one that's just a little bit different and somewhat odd. I have 4 different variance terms, and then it turns out that 2 and 4 covary with each other, but none of the others do. Yeah, Ben.
So do you have to manually adjust these like you do in the state space model, or is there a way to figure out what combinations you should be running?
The former. Yes. So yeah, you can't just say, okay, do some exhaustive search and find me kind of the best option here. You have to give it a starting spot from which to go. We will talk about this a lot moving forward. I do not recommend entering into this exercise just blindly. This is a situation where before you get that, what do you know about this system? Here, where 2 and 4 covary, maybe these are the same species, just in 2 different nearby locations, or maybe they're 2 different species in the exact same location. Maybe this is a predator and this is a prey. So they would actually, inversely vary, that sort of thing. Here, right, was there something about the survey design where it was the same person that went out and counted all of those things? Oh, yeah, sure. Then assuming they're not any better as counting perch than they are bass or something like that, fine. Here's maybe a situation where we had 4 different observers, all of them with different skill. Right? So the idea is that you want the design of any of these things, and this is not just for this covariance matrix, it's for other covariance matrix, it's for those models themselves. They should really reflect something realistically about the system at hand. And as I always tell people, you go through this exercise, yeah, and I could, like we were talking about before, we could combine all kinds of different things and come up with, I don't know, 40, 50, 80 different versions of this, fit them all. And then somewhere someone comes, this is the best one, Mark. I say, okay, what's going on between 2 and 4? Why do those covary and the others don't? And I get this. Right? I mean, you have to write the discussion of this paper at some point. And so being able to, justify what it is you've done and why it makes sense is an important thing. That's an important part of being a scientist here. Okay. The other question is, we've talked about this before. This was this question. Are we going to have this, all of the data going to be a function of 1 trend, 2 trends, 3 trends, more? How are we going to decide what we should use here? Does anybody have an idea before I reveal the answer? You've already seen these tools. You've done this in labs and in other exercises, probably before you even got to this class. So let's just say we had 3 candidates. Here's Eli's guess, here's Eric's guess, and here's my guess. How are we going to figure out who's most likely to be correct? Great, that would be a perfect example, right? So what Matthias is doing is, okay, Mark, fit a model where this looks like this, fit another one where it looks like this, and fit a third where it looks like this. Which one of those is most parsimonious? It has the lowest delta AIC. Yeah, Ben.
This is combining multiple like underlying trends. I forget exactly.
Yeah, so each column of Z is going to correspond to one of these hidden states. Right, so rows of Z have to match the rows of X. The columns of Z have to match the rows, or sorry, that was the rows of Y. Columns of Z match the rows of X. Yeah,
Just going back to my original question, I believe that would be very hard to estimate like outside a DFA, for example, because that would require estimating like a discrete parameter, because that would be like the number of states and not each layer or something like that. Right?
Yeah, it turns out that as written like this model is unidentifiable. So in a little bit, we're going to show you some tricks to identify what these things are. Yeah, Anna.
think this is- All right, maybe we get to it, but how does this, I know for spatial stuff, you do EOFs a lot, like, are there ways to let this define itself? That's my understanding of what EOF does, if you essentially let the data speak for itself.
Yeah, you could, in theory, do that, but in practice, we will fix this structure, fit one model, fix this structure, fit that model, and then do that iteratively. Then you can also imagine, like thinking about like for loops. Okay, we'll run one for loop that's going to go over different forms of Z. And we've probably got another one where we're looking at different forms of R. And again, I wouldn't just do this completely willy-nilly. You probably have some good reason to do that. And then you may be thinking about something about this or other forms of that.
But there's no way to kind of let it, no method to just let the data define itself. You do have to iterate through and see what.
Yep, these are all fixed and unknown going into this. So the data are going to tell us what it thinks all of these values are. Yeah, so there's a little bit of analogous to that, but no, it's not going to magically just hand to the thing and then it's going to spit out like AutoRima, right? Where that just grinds away and it's like, yep, that's a 311. This is not going to do that for you. You will have to set these structures and then put that.
Yeah, and like thinking about PCA, which is kind of like the EOF, like with PCA, you're picking a rotation where it explains the most variance. You add another one, adds a little more variance, and another one is going to explain a little more variance. And then you decide, hey, I'm going to pick these, the top two axes. Explains 90% of the variance. And this is a little different in that it's not kind of making that like it's not like structuring the x's that way where it's saying this x explains x much variance.
Yeah, that's a really important, we will get to that later in class, but that's oftentimes a question I get asked. Okay, I fit a DFA model, and let's say if this was the most parsimonious form. I had 25 time series, and they all seem to be largely a function of 3 underlying states. Then the question is, well, like Eli was saying, a standard PCA will tell you PC1 explains 50% of the variation. PC2 is another 25. How do I get from this to that? And it's actually pretty simple and straightforward. You know what this is, so you can multiply Z times X, and you can pull out what this column is times the first row of that. Just break this thing out and think of it as you have 3 predictors. Call this Z1, Z2, in quotes here, something Z3 times X1, X2, X3. And then all you have to do is say, okay, based on that, what's the correlation or the R squared with that? And that will tell you how much variance essentially trend 1 is explaining, how much trend 2 is explaining, how much trend 3. That said, there is no ordering here. So this might explain 5% of the variation, this one might explain 80, and this one says 2 or something like that, right? It doesn't rank order the biggest, most. You can do that post hoc. But that's something that we as sort of an analyst have to take upon ourselves to figure out. It's not just going to spit out like an R squared value. Let's see that. Okay, so now we're going to take a little bit of time and talk about fitting these models in practice. That's sort of, this is where we're aiming for. But as I said, we need to fit these models and then we'll compare them with AIC as ATSA. So it turns out that unless we constrain this matrix Z in some way, there are an infinite number of combinations of these things that will give you the same result. Because the reason is, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, This state equation here is not prescribed going into this analysis. This is not like some exogenous covariate that we're handing you now. Here's the time series of temperature. Here's the time series of precipitation, tidal heights. This is something that is unknown to us and the rest of the world until we begin. So what's happening is all of these things are being, it's just trading off z's here. So you can think of this as some landscape. This gets big and then it gets small, big, small, and it's doing this. At the same time, all of this stuff is moving around. So these are fixed and known. This is wiggling. This is wiggling. Right? So think about this up here. If this is completely free and this is completely free, I could come up with all kinds of combinations of Z and X that are going to make Y. Okay. So that's one. Z we're going to have to constrain. First one we're going to talk about is this A vector here. These are what we've been talking about as sort of biases or an underlying level. So given some true state of nature, where is the observed time series relative to that? And remember, this is just adjusting the level up or down. So you can think of it as just sort of like, this is essentially the mean of this. So the way we have to do this, we start with something like this. And in a DFA model, we have to set the first M elements to 0. And M here, remember, is the dimension of the state. It's how many rows we have in the state. So in this one, 3. So that means we'd have to set the first 3 elements of this to 0, and then all the others could be non-zero. Okay, here's an example where we have N is 5 and M is 2. So this is where we would have started with this. And we just said before we have to make the first M elements of A equal to 0. So this is what this will look like. Now that said, and I might even have a slide. Let me see if I have that slide. Yes. Oftentimes this constraint is not enough. And so often what we will do is take all of those different time series we have, those Ys, and subtract the mean from each one so that each one of them now has an expectation of 0. They're all doing their own thing. They're just all centered on 0. We don't have one up here and one here. Okay. If you do that, I mentioned a moment ago, right, that these elements of A here are essentially the mean, the expectation of the Y. If you set all of the means here to be 0 because you subtracted them out, that suggests this whole thing should just go away. That just goes to 0. And that's what we've done here. So this is something that we almost like pretty uniformly, with maybe very rare exceptions, we would start with our data, standardize them so they have mean 0, and then you just set this vector equal to 0 and you don't estimate it at all. In fact, we just saved 3 degrees of freedom here because we don't have to estimate it in this example. Okay, that's A. Now let's get on to this thing with Z. So here is our loading matrix. We saw one where it was 1, 2, 3. Here I've got one where it's big. I don't know what M is. Maybe Y is 100 or 200 or 300. And Z might be 10 even. Or I mean, M is 10. So we'd have 10 columns here. What we have to do is set the upper right triangle of Z to 0. What do I mean by that? So it's a little hard to see in this one. So I'll do this with a set example. So here we had 5 time series. So N is 5. And let's say we have 3 underlying trends we're going to mess with. Here's setting the upper right triangle to 0. So the rule is for the first M minus 1 rows, so M is 3, so that's for the first 2 rows, row 1, row 2, set Zij equal to 0 if j greater than I. So here j is 2, I is 1, yep. J3, I is 1, yep. J3, I2, yep. None of the rest of these fit that rule, so the rest of them just get parameters to be estimated. Okay. If you pause for a moment and think about this, I just said earlier that we wanted all of our observed time series to be linear combination of 3 different states. Z times x1, I got it. 0 times x2, that's 0. 0 times x3 is 0. So what I've done here now is this first observed time series is just a linear, it's some function of only the first trend. The second is only the second trend, and then all the others get out. How can that be, Mark? Well, again, it's that we just need a way to solve for the rest of this problem. We'll set these 0. You're going to see later on that we can actually recover what these are by doing a basis rotation. But again, these steps are purely for computational purposes. It's just so that we can actually estimate these things here. Okay, in addition, if any of you end up doing something like this in a Bayesian context, maybe you've coded your own, you need this upper right triangle to be zeros, but you also need to set the prior on this top diagonal so that they're all greater than 0. So these are set to be positive. And we could talk about this. Some of what happens in Bayesian things when you have chains, they can flip. So -1 times an opposite chain is going to give you the same as 1 times, right? So this is one way to stop chains from flipping back and forth and being able to assign the right value. But we won't do this in here. We'll use just some likelihood approaches, so you won't have to worry about that. Okay. Third component here is this state variance or covariance. So here, we talked about different forms of this covariance matrix are diagonal, diagonal and unequal, some kind of hodgepodge covariance structure that we cooked up ourselves. Now, though, we've got these hidden states, these random walks, and typically we're trying to estimate what this Q is. That becomes very difficult again, because this is largely free. We've got a small constraint here. We set the upper right triangle to 0, and we said these are free. So we've got 2 different levers here that we can pull back and forth as much as we. So what we'd like to do is create some constraints on these random walks, make that work. So we're going to constrain Q. And a simple way of doing that is we just set this Q equal to the identity matrix. And just as a reminder, the identity matrix is a square matrix with 1s down the diagonal and 0s everywhere else. So we're not going to estimate Q, we're going to prescribe that. So in the Mars context, when you're defining Q in your model list, Q equals, and you can put identity in quotes, and that will make it an identity matrix. So here's an example of where I had 4 trends. This is what Q will look like. If it's 3, right, those pieces just go away. It's always going to be a diagonal matrix with 1s on the diagonal and 0s everybody else. It turns out that having a variance of 1 for this is plenty to be able to make things go, you'll see in lab today, you can actually create a seasonal pattern based on a random walk. It's not a very good model for that, but you can make it do it. So this is sufficient. And as it turns out, is a necessary constraint. I can tell you that you could make these something else. You can make them 10 or 100, but you always want to make sure they're the same. And basically it becomes a scaling issue with this, right? Because the variance here controls how much these things can move around, and you're going to multiply Z times this. So the combination of these two has to get you pretty close to Y. So if Y is on the order of 0 to 10, and you make this on the order of like, minus 1 million to 1 million, these are going to have to be pretty small, because to get from 1 million down to 10, you're roughly going to have to divide by 10 to the 5th, right? And that can be challenging for algorithms as well, because when trying to solve for these things, constraining a model such that these are tiny can be very hard numerically for a solver to figure out. Okay.
That's why the scaling also helps, right?
Yes.
I guess, but it's easier. to-
Yep, exactly, because then we just eliminate more parameters that we don't have to estimate. We know those. Okay. This is a really important thing that I'm going to emphasize a bit here now and moving forward. It is entirely possible to include covariates in your DFA model. Right? So if you think back to the very beginning, we were talking about these kind of fixed or deterministic aspects and then this random aspect. This, together with this is kind of your fixed bit. And then what's left over is a random bit, some of which is this kind of white noise term, and some is a linear combination of random walks. In the case where you have any suspicion that there is a covariate that will help explain the common patterns that you were seeing, absolutely include that in this model. So like in the lab today, like I said, you're going to be dealing with monthly data on some things, and they have this, it's so obvious, this seasonal pattern. And one of the exercises, they don't even bother with that. They're just like, oh yeah, fit a DFA model and you get it. Like, yeah, why not think about those seasonal things that Eli talked about on Tuesday, right? Either some fixed effect per month or a cubic spline or that sine plus cosine wave, right? If you see that sort of thing in the data, put something in there that will do that instead of asking your kind of random trend to pick that out for you, because it's super obvious and you know that's the case. Same thing, if this is the size of fish at a given age and you know something about temperature, okay, fish are cold-blooded. You know, when it's warmer, they tend to grow more than they do when it's cold, assuming you're within their proper scope for growth. But the idea is do not pass on covariates when you know them or you really expect them to be important. Brian, did you have a question?
Yeah, so are we still in like a traditional kind of like state space place with these models, or are we now like considering the X equation as like this like autocorrelated error? Like, would you include covariates in the state equation as well, or would you want to put them all in the observation equation?
I would put them in the observation equation because you're really, in this case, this is not typically that underlying state of nature that we've been talking about. It's not like population dynamics. It's not a Gompertz model or something like this. Is just kind of a thing, an autocorrelated thing. The best way to think about this in the DFA context, the states here, these X's, are an unknown and unmeasured covariate. It's something that really matters, but you didn't measure it. And you don't even know that it matters right now. Okay. So that's why the extent that you can add things in that do matter, or you have really good reason to believe they matter, you start adding things in here, the amount of variance explained by this is going up, and the amount of variance explained by these is going down. It's a mass balance equation. Yeah, Eric.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, and people ask it all the time about putting the covariates into the X's versus the Y's, and I think another reason, echoing what Mark said, is that when you put them in the X's, they become essentially multiplicative, so that your covariate affects, you know, because it's this random walk, it's going to affect all future states, and in the Y's, it's not going to have that property. It's going to be additive, so that's a big difference.
Yeah, but this is something, and I will show you again, we'll talk about this a little bit. This is essentially just a mixed effects regression model. Here's your fixed effects. There's one of your random effects. And when fitting these, it's important that you actually do this in a set order. But always, if you have covariates that you would feel, again, this is like first principles kind of stuff, right? Like I'm measuring the concentration of nutrients in a river, and this is something about precipitation. Right, you put more water in there, the concentration is going to go down, I guarantee it, unless the stuff coming off the landscape has the exact same concentration, right? So it won't, everyone in here works in a system where you could very quickly come up with some things like this that you think should matter. And this is, again, this is where all the fun and all the interesting stuff is. We'll talk about this again, DFA papers, you get to the end, everyone's going to have a plot of what these loadings look like. You'll see that in the lab, and you're going to plot of these. And then everyone sits there in their discussion and has to tell us what they think this thing is. Yeah, okay, populations 1, 7, and 8 all seem to follow trend 1, and that looks a lot like, and they fill in the blank. And oftentimes it's because it's something you think matters, but you just don't have it at hand. So to the extent that you have a covariate that you could include, do it. Absolutely, yes. So temperature, precipitation, tidal cycle, you know, all those sort of things, PDO. Yep, it's just like a multiple regression, beta 1 times x1, beta 2 times x2, et cetera. Yep. Just like Eli was saying on Tuesday when we were talking about covariate effects, whether this is big D, little d, or big C, little c here, you really want to think about what the form of D is that you're going to use. Remember, you will tell it what this is. That's your time series of temperature, precipitation. So this is what the model is going to estimate for you. It's the effect of temperature on whatever that response was. Yeah, Ben.
And that's where you can weigh how much you think the covariance impacts versus the other, the big T.
Yes, you could do that as a matter of fact. Yeah. Also, I didn't write it here explicitly, but these things could be lagged. You might want temperature 6 months ago or something like that, or, you know, a year and a half ago or whatever it is. So this, you can imagine a minus H here where H is some lag and it doesn't even have to vary. So, right, it could be temperature this month, rainfall 2 months ago, something else, right? Those don't, that doesn't matter. You can move those things around and adjust them accordingly. So when you're doing this, you want to make some assumptions about how you think those effects vary or are the same depending on things like location or the species or that sort of thing, right? So Eli had something very similar to this the other day. Let's say we're going to estimate the effects of temperature and salinity in this model. Here, it's location or species invariant. There's one effect of temperature and one effect of salinity. Just this parameter is repeated many times, but it is the same thing. Over here, every species or location or whatever gets its unique effect of temperature, right? So there's N of these, there's N of these. Now, again, this could be temp 1, 1, 1, 1, temp 2, 2, 2, 2, temp 1, 1, temp 2, 2, temp 3, 3, 3, you know, something like that. So there's no symmetry that is required here. This is ecology, right? And if you don't know, sometimes somebody might fit this one, and then they might fit this one. But before you start diving deep into that pool, I would give some strong consideration as to whether you think that's necessary or not. Let's see. I'm working on sockeye salmon across a large swath of Southwest Alaska. Do I really think that temperature affects sockeye salmon differently? Whether they're in, you know, the Nushagak or maybe, but I'm not picking on you over there, folks, but it's a system I actually know well, right? But you might be like, no, you know, for simplicity's sake, I'm gonna say, yeah, the effect on sockeye is the same. Or, you know, you would have good reason to believe if it wasn't. So really think hard about this because again, somewhere you're going to have to tell us what all of this stuff means. You will have to get up in front of your committee at your defense. You will have to write the paper and justify it to the reviewers, etc. Okay. Quick note on model selection. How are we doing on time here? Good. We'll take a break in just a little bit before we go to lab. I said, okay, how would we determine what form of Z? And Mateus said, oh, we could just fit different models and look at AIC. And I said, I totally agree with that. The problem runs into this. When we start comparing models that have varying combinations of these kind of fixed effects, the covariates, and the random effects, these trends, you're not exactly on level footing. And what do I mean by that? So think about this DFA model here where I've got some latent trends. So I don't know what this is yet. We're going to try to figure that out. And I've got some covariates, D, temperature, salinity, etc. These, as I mentioned before, going into this exercise, nobody knows. this will be determined as part of our exercise. These, we absolutely know what those are. We measured them or somebody measured them and gave it to us. Okay, unknown, known. So here, we've got 3 time series. This model has 2 unknown trends we're going to estimate. There's here. This model has 1 unknown trend. So we've got 1 column here, but we've got some covariate here. Okay. So if you think about this, I haven't done any sort of constraint, so I haven't set this to 0 in this model. But if you count this up, 6 parameters, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 parameters. So the same number of estimated parameters in both of these models. Which do you think has more flexibility to fit the data? Yeah, why do you say that, Matthias? You're right.
Okay, good. Because it's easier to estimate the multiple numbers rather than the variance.
Yeah, it's because here we have these, we can mix these up all we want, and we can mix this up. We can mix these up, but we cannot touch this. This is prescribed. Here, we can mix all of these up, and we can mix both of these up. So we got all kinds of possibilities here, endless essentially, right? So given these 2 models, unless the correlation between this thing and these is unbelievably high, like, you know, an R-squared of 0.9 or something like that, this model would almost certainly always be favored over this model in an AIC context, simply because it has more flexibility to fit the data.
So
Yes.
you're saying usually the likelihood of the 2 models here, same data, the likelihood of the first one usually be higher.
Yep. Purely because there's more flexibility in the space, because you can, all 6 of these are free and these will wiggle.
You
Right.
had the top right corner set to 0.
If we did that constraint, then we'd had 5. I
And they
still
would be
think,
the same, right? The same number of parameters these models estimating. I guess
Well-
there's more information in the bottom
more information in the,
because there's that actual fixed data that you're
yeah, this is immutable.
right. Yeah.
So you just have to adjust these so that this is, you're trying to maximize the variation explained by this linear combination. So yeah, someone had said, okay, Mark, you told us a minute ago this had to be 0. So really this is a 5 parameter model compared to 4. You're still going to get a better fit here. Yeah, Ben.
So is there a way you can build in normalization for the extra flexibility, or does that just shake out in the AIC?
Should shake out in, well, like I said, you're not on fair footing. So we'll talk about this in just a moment, but basically the way to think about this is to step back. These are nothing more than linear mixed models. Here's fixed effect, here's a random effect. Yes, Anna.
But how would you compare it? Or how would you, because they're structured, so AIC would work.
Yeah, so, okay, so right in this case, I just told you that you're probably not going to get the right answer by AIC, so sure, out of sample prediction is always a really good idea. And remember we were talking early on, Eli, we were talking about like predictive models, like we were trying to make a forecast. If this is something you know something about, like you can get it with a proper lag, right? Like if I tell you upwelling this spring, you can tell me what smolt survival is a couple of years later. In a forecasting context, this is great, right? Because you've now fit a model and I give you what this is and you're like, okay, Mark's survival is going to be 2%. I mean, here, what are we going to use for a prediction? We would literally have to simulate a random walk 1 more time step and then stick that into the model. And what is that? Random walks are horrible forecast models. Okay. So in a forecast context, this one is going to be garbage. Unless one of these things is like some really obvious cyclical trend, something like that. So that's when that's picking all that out. This is going to be better. So yes, thinking about things like out of sample accuracy, those kind of things. Okay, so I just said this, unless this D is super highly correlated, you're always going to favor a model like this. Yep.
You would probably favor model 1 or something where you're working with like cast or trying to explain past processes and then if you were interested in projecting, you might use model 2, or how would you go about that? If you,
Well, I would be a fan of this model in general, even in a hindcast context, because this is telling us something about, right? We're trying to relate something in this class anyway. We're talking about some aspect of the environment relating to some other aspect of the environment. And to me, this is where all the interest is.
or could you use model 1 as informative of there's 2 major things or processes explaining variance, and now I'm going to search for covariates that have the same. Could you use that?
Totally. That is where a lot of people do this. It's sort of like, okay, my advisor just handed me this data file with all this stuff, and I'm doing some exploratory stuff right now. Yeah, these kinds of things would help you figure out what that is. In fact, there's some other variations of models where that's exactly what people do. They don't even try to do this. They do this, and then they pass around plots of X1, X2, et cetera, to all their colleagues, and they say, what does this look like to you? And it gets to lilac, she's like, holy cow, this is salinity. I've seen this many times before. So then you go back, you find the salinity, you put that in here, and then re-estimate it. Because there you're a little closer to the mechanism. It's more satisfying, I guess, for me as a scientist, and typically for your audience. Okay, so this is really the information you will find if you're looking at linear mixed models. Ben Bolker has a classic review paper on this that if you don't have it in your library, you should. But basically the way this works is the first thing you do is you fit what we call a saturated model. You put everything in there that you can imagine. Every single covariate that you, your roommate, your committee, everyone else has decided this is going to make. And then you fit that. Okay. Then what you do is you keep those covariates fixed so that big D times little d, don't change that at all. And then start messing around with the number of trends. 1, 2, 3, with that D structure always in there. Then once you get that, you set those, you choose R. And then once you've done that, you go back, you keep the number of states fixed. So this might be 2. This is diagonal and unequal. And then you start doing AIC on your covariates. So then you start peeling them off because the first model had everything in there. All 10 of them or whatever that number was. Then you put in 9 or 8, et cetera, et cetera. This is the approved method for doing that. And again, like I said, this is no different than if you're taking Quorum 514 with Sarah this quarter. She will tell you this exact recipe when you're doing linear mixed models. Lots of people do not follow this advice and they end up with they're changing that thing we said before. It's like, oh, it's a 4-parameter model. They had 2 state, and it's like, it's not apples to apples. Maybe apples to pears, maybe, but not quite. Okay. Real quick before we take a break and go to lab. Remember I mentioned that we had to set this upper right triangle to 0 in order to basically make this a solvable problem. And so that means this first time series is a function of the first trend, second is the first 2, third, et cetera, until you get up to whatever M is. We'd like a way to be able to actually kind of sort this mess out. And the way this works is we're going to do something that's called a basis rotation. And all that is you can think about like in 2 space, here we have X and Y. If we just rotated this thing 45 degrees, sort of thing. That's all we're doing to this model, but we're going to do it in this really high dimensional space. It's super hard to imagine. It turns out that you can find some matrix H that makes this model, this is our standard DFA model that we've been working with, entirely equivalent to this model. And if this makes immediate sense to anyone in here, congratulations, I will find an award for you because I did not understand any of this the first time I looked at it. So the question is, how on earth are we going to figure out what H is? And we have a rationale for doing this, and that's going to be to basically get these values that had some zeros in, we're going to fill those in by getting Z times H inverse. The method that we're going to use, which is generally prescribed for DFAs, is this thing called Varimax that stands for variance maximization. And what a Varimax rotation will do is it will attempt to stretch something in multivariate space such that it maximizes the variance along just a few axes. And I'll show you an example in a minute of how this works. So here is a PCA of 5 different wines, each one of which is scored with some attribute. Okay, so here's X1, here's X2. How expensive or cheap is it? How much sugar? Do you like it with dessert? Is it good with meat? How much alcohol is it? How acidic? And I don't even remember what hedonic means. Somebody will have to remind me. Okay, here we've got 2 PC1, PC2. I just call them X1 and X2 here. If we rotate that basis, these axes, so all I've done is take this thing and just rotate it a little bit and relabel them R1 and R2. If you squint, the distance from any one of these points to R1 or R2 is less for the blue case than it is for the black case. And you have to really squint. And if it doesn't immediately seem reasonable to you, believe me. Okay. So all that was me applying a Varimax rotation to this, which essentially, whoops, sorry about that, which is doing that. So I'll show you what that looks like here. So in rotated space, these things moved to these different spots. So here's our rotated one. This one is very close to that. These 3 have moved much closer. This one got a little further away, but in net, if we summed up all of those differences, the gray points are closer to that line, those lines, than the black points. So that's all Varimax rotation is going to do. And you will see in the lab, there is a function in R that basically will figure all of this out for you. You don't have to do anything. And then you can just do the multiplication. Basically, it will take you from this model to this model. And in practice, you will notice very little difference. Like when you plot, look at these Z's and these X's, look at these X's and the product of these 2, you will hardly notice the difference. And the only reason we do this is because you'll see when we start fitting these models, you have these random walks and things are loading on them. We're trying to come up with a situation where we can use as few of those trends as possible to explain the amount of information there. So if we can maximize the variation explained along one of those trends, that's better than having multiple trends do all of the work for us. Okay, so like I said, don't feel bad about any of this. You will be able to basically create one function in R will do all of this for you, and you will be done. Questions about that before we think? Yeah, we just covered all of this. Questions before we take a break and then move into lab? Yeah, Ben.
Is there a minimum that you need in a time series to be able to use DFA?
A minimum N?
Either like a number of time series or a number of points in a time series?
Good. Number of points in a time series. That's the $1 million question. We get asked all the time. Can I just use 3 subjects? That's a joke for clinical people. That you typically don't ever know that going into because that's a function of like, do you have multiples? Like 2 observations of shorter time length can get you some more information. How noisy are those? What's the ratio of observation error to process? So the length is a tricky one. The number of time series you need should be at least 1 more than the number of estimated states. So, right, you could do a DFA where you had 3 time series and you wanted to estimate it based on 2 states. Sure, you could do that. Because I think though, again, let me just back up here for a moment. Really, you just want to think about this as a linear regression. It's a mixed effects model. Here's my fixed predictors. Here's my random effect. That happens to be autocorrelated, but it is just a random effect. In most cases, in a linear mixed model, you're trying to make a bunch of inference here. And then sometimes, yeah, there's a little bit left over. You have a random effect of location or something like that. But this typically, it's just nuisance stuff. Anything else about the? Yeah, Eli.
You might from the Mars TMB?
Oh.
Everybody jumps into this, because usually often you're working with these massive data sets.
Yeah, so thank you for reminding me. Many of you may be familiar with the template model builder software, TMB. It's a standalone programming language that allows you to do basically fit very complicated statistical models like these using a Laplace transformation as opposed to maximum likelihood. The Mars package, you can use some combination of either expectation maximization or a BFGS solver to do that, because this thing, even after we zero out that upper right triangle, trying to figure out what elements these are and Z is hard problem. It is a really hard problem. So 2 years ago when we were doing this class, Eli and Eric sat down and they wrote a TMB version of the Mars package. So it uses TMB on the back end. The front end is exactly the same. You've still defined a model list just as you would. In the Mars call, instead, for where there's a method, you say TMB rather than AEM or BFGS, something like that. It's a different thing you have to download. It's Mars TMB is the package name. But if you get into fitting DFA models, like for your project, probably not for the lab. You could, it will be much, much faster, like orders of magnitude faster. Years ago, I was working with a master's student here in SAFS, and she had growth rates for Chinook salmon captured as smolts out migrating in the Columbia, hundreds of time series of length reconstructions. So we had this big DFA model. We literally had to run it on a supercomputer owned by this group Domino, it was a big data science, and it took like days. Using the TMB version, you could probably solve that problem now in like 5 minutes. So TMB version is way, way, way faster. Much more. They're both robust. Given enough time, you just use the standard Mars one, it will grind along and it can find that. But this is another reason to think about how complex you want this to be. How many states do I really want? Sure, I've got 30 time series. Let's try one where this is 20. But really what you want to do, is that getting you anywhere? So, and then this part as well, right? If you've got these effects in there, it will be much, much easier to solve. So, and we're happy to work with any of you on that who want to do so. For the lab stuff today, you should just be able to use a straight up one. Some of your models could take 5 or 10 minutes to fit after you hit enter. So just be patient. If it seems like something's thinking, it is. Eric.
I was gonna say 2 things. One, to Ben's question about how many time series, I think Mark had a good point about replicate observations being really powerful. If you have multiple people surveying a stream, for example, at the same time. And the way to bring that into DFA is we've got the Z matrix that's super flexible, and you can create replicate time series in your data matrix. And then with Z, you can just essentially replicate the rows of that Z matrix. So if you're, I don't know, pick one of these. So like maybe row 3 and row 2, maybe row 3 is a replicate observation of row 2. You can just go into the Z matrix before you fit the model and rename those parameters to be the same shared as Z2. And then it's going to estimate fewer parameters and allow you to kind of treat them as replicates. So
yes, I've done that before. So what Eric is saying, imagine this is Z11, this would also be Z11 if you had 2 things that were going to Z12, Z12. So this thing, there's shortcuts that you can use for building this in Mars. Otherwise, you'd build these by hand, code the thing out, zero up this upper right triangle, that sort of thing. So yes, to Eric's point, you get this is somewhat flexible in the design, but it needs to all square up when you do this math, right? You want the appropriate rows here to correspond to the appropriate columns.
Yeah, but there is a shortcut in the Mars package where you don't have to build this by hand. You're going to be able to tell it the model form and say, hey, I want to do a DFA. I want to have 3 X's, and then it's going to construct the Z for you.
Yep.
The other thing I was going to say is second point was around non-stationarity, and so I think we can wrap our heads around what does non-stationarity mean. And with really long time series, there's, the X's are really flexible in terms of capturing these potentially non-stationary trends. But a challenge is that the loadings themselves might also change over time in terms of what they represent. And so there's not really a good way that I've seen where those can be estimated simultaneously. I was involved in a project recently though with some folks from the Alaska Fishery Science Center, and they took an interesting approach where you can basically, if you have 100 time steps, you could do an approach where you're doing essentially like an iterative moving window, where you fit a DFA to the first 70 years, and then you add in, another 10 years, and then another 10 years, and then another 10 years, and you look at for each of those models, how the loadings are changing over time. So that's a potentially one way to kind of get around it. But it's just, I think it's generally not the kind of thing we worry about because our time series are so short. But for those really long time series type, or really if you have a lot of data, that's also something to think about.
Yep. Okay, let's take a break. Y'all can come back in 5 or 10 minutes. Eric and Eli and I will be here. Stop sharing this. And then, let's see here.